Welcome to Alternate Endings.
Half audiobook.
Half podcast.
Full apocalypse.
New episodes every Monday.
Start your week considering how everything could come to an end.
The following story is titled Frozen Intervention, written by our very own Nico, narrated by both Nico and Tyler.
It was deathly frigid out. But when is it not? Still, that did not matter to Luke. This was about survival just as much as it's about revenge. He would have wandered into a colder, darker night if need be. Luke's oxygen tank flutters as his footsteps crunch in the snow. His exosuit keeps his core temperature at an appropriate level, but he can still feel the frost deep in his bones. The wind whistles wildly on the open desert of snow. His mask is fogged, but Luke remains unfazed. He can't see 5 feet in front of him in this blizzard anyway. He knew the way, though. He knew it by heart. It was the only other station within 50 miles of them. He has made this trip countless times, storm or not. And he's aware of the dangers of leaving when he did. The station, nicknamed Oasis, was only 5 miles away from Luke's. Both stations depended on each other to keep the other alive. That all went out the window 1 week ago when Luke's station, Station Ambrosia, stopped receiving water from Station Oasis. Luke continues onward. The 5-mile journey is a little outstretched due to the storm. But Luke sees the station ahead in a brief moment of calm. One last ridge to descend, and Luke will be upon Oasis. It's impossible to imagine that this area used to be so full of life. Luscious foliage, a forest of trees, streams of water carving a winding path through the ground. Luke wouldn't have believed the stories he told about the Earth if he hadn't seen it before the invasion. Luke remembers the first time he saw the invasion on the news. A craft of unimaginable size had entered our solar system, and within a week, it had placed itself perfectly in between the sun and our Earth. This planet-sized craft constantly rotated to keep the Earth in a perpetual darkness. Without direct sunlight, the surface temperature dropped quickly, quicker than scientists first thought it would. It was astonishing to see how fast a threat to the world could unite all of humanity. Still, it was a futile effort. Nothing humans could conjure would have any effect. Nothing we could have done would have changed the outcome. It was impossible to fight a target that massive, miles above our Earth's atmosphere. Humanity had no way to combat a threat like this. We had barely made it to Mars the year before the invasion. Our technology was clearly surpassed. This was the first time humans would encounter another form of life, and it may very well be the last. After weeks, the majority of plant life had died. Entire countries rioted themselves to oblivion, starved and helpless to the will of the visitors from another world. After the plants, followed the majority of animal life on land and in the oceans. Self-sustaining stations were now the only livable place for life that once inhabited Earth. The internal temperature of the Earth has not been changed as drastically as the surface. That's why the remaining humans are forced into the geothermal stations, buried into the crust. Few people scattered across the world fighting the daily task of surviving on this now alien planet. Humanity scrapes what it can from this Earth to continue that evolutionary drive for survival. Luke is close to the station. A quarter-mile left. He thinks back to a small farming station. There were only 13 people there. Now that number dropped to 9 since the lack of water from Oasis Station. Luke is pushed forward remembering those from his station who, at this point, were no less than family. It's a difficult thing being surrounded by the one thing that is vital for your survival, but it's locked away in an ice prison. Oasis had the only capabilities for the purification process of all this water. Everyone will die if it remains unoperational. Luke couldn't imagine any reason good enough for Oasis Station to stop its operations. This only angered Luke more once he saw the station had full power and seemed to be fully functioning. Luke reaches the main entrance. A light above the bay door spins, casting a hue of red and orange into the blowing snow. Red and orange. Luke knows that means the station is on lockdown. He walks to the side of the bay doors. He opens a hatch using a security code given to him by the Oasis station lead. He manually opens the door just enough so he can squeeze through. Luke then shuts the door behind him. The main entryway of the station is silent and still. Just that familiar light flashing the orange and red alert. The temperature was colder than it should be inside the station. Luke is put on edge more than he already is. His anger is now accompanied with fear as he observes the entryway for signs of what is happening. Minus the lack of a few lift operators and the drop in temperature, everything else seemed in place. Luke peers down the corridor that descends a 45-degree angle for a few hundred feet. A track lay center of the downward passageway, on the right an exposed stairwell. Luke attempts to call the lift up, to no avail. Everything seems to be running on auxiliary power. Other than the lights, it appears nothing is operational. He makes his way down the stairwell, parallel to the tracks. Luke makes it to the bottom of the track and enters the main foyer of the station. A large 40-foot by 40-foot room was empty and dark. On his left were the sleeping quarters, kitchen, and infirmary. On his right were the control room and the water purification facility. But things were in disarray. Chairs knocked to the ground, tables flipped. It looked like a riot had occurred down here. The orange and red light starts to become an eerie reminder as it flashes and illuminates the destruction. Luke was stopped in his tracks as he took a few more steps into the main corridor. Something caught his eye. Someone caught his eye. There on the ground, a lifeless pile of what used to be a person, reduced to a mass of blood, flesh, and bone. The smell would have been a lot worse if Luke still didn't have his mask on. Luke couldn't stare for long at the shreds of that poor soul. There was no way to identify who it was. He moved even more cautiously into the sleeping quarters. Luke was stunned. More bodies, more devastation. His heart raced as he moved from room to room. Luke felt nauseous as he came across two bodies of two children that he had come to know. He is speechless and lost in his paranoia. Luke makes his way to the emergency exit of the facility. There's only one small stairwell that exits through the back of the station. One sealed door at the top, one more at the bottom. Both doors had been obliterated. Snow was reaching almost all the way down the 300-foot stairwell. Luke sees now why there was an obscure drop in the temperature in the station. Suddenly, a clank was heard from down the hallway. Luke pushes his back flat against the wall and creeps carefully towards the noise. He peers around the corner, and he sees a familiar face. His name was Francis. He was covered in blood, wrapped up in thick blankets with a beanie placed cocked on his head. Francis sat at a table in the middle of the room and stared straight ahead. Luke grabs a piece of wood from a broken table and approaches slowly, in Francis's eyesight. Francis, it's me, Luke. Francis, it's me, Luke. Francis looks at Luke's face and quickly down again. What happened? No response. Luke is at the table now. He finds himself a chair and sits across from Francis, his face distraught, his eyes red from tears that had been streaming down his face. He breathes unsteadily. Come on, Francis. What happened? Francis stares off to the side of Luke. Frank! Luke smacks his hand on the table. Francis doesn't flinch. The air is still, and Luke feels uneasy in Frank's presence. Luke stares across the table, seeing how traumatized Frank is from whatever occurred here. Frank finally starts to speak, very softly and slowly.
They ate her, Luke.
Luke's gaze widens from the words that had spilt out of Frank's mouth, unsure if he had heard correctly. What?
They ripped her to shreds right in front of me. I hid and I watched as they tore my little girl up and ate her.
Jesus Christ, Frank.
I hid like a coward. I stayed in that spot for 3 days staring at my girl. I couldn't move. Not until I knew they were gone.
Until who was gone, Frank? Francis lost focus again and drifted off into his mind. Frank, who?
They did. The ones from above.
Luke stands and takes a few steps back in terror from what he had heard. That ship had sat up there for almost 2 years with no signs of life. Even after we launched our full arsenal of weaponry, that ship didn't even move a meter. Why now? Luke tries to shake off the news as best as he can, remembering the reason he was here. Look, Frank, I need your help. My station is dying. I need to get this water plant running again. We gotta go, now. Frank's eyes are hollow. He opens his mouth to speak. Luke walks up to Frank and places his hand on his shoulder. Come on, Frank. I need you. Frank peers into Luke's eyes and stands after a few moments.
Okay.
The two make their way to the water facility. The facility is in a room 35 feet tall, goes back at least 50 feet from the entrance. Pipes and wires line the interior walls, and the main filtration system towers in the middle of the room.
All right. We can get the power back on if we restart the whole system.
Luke nods in agreement. The two hastily run through the process of restarting the Oasis station. After a half hour of Frank directing Luke around, they restart the power.
All right. Let's head to the control room to run a system diagnostics.
In the control room, Luke waits patiently as Frank runs through all the systems to check they are working properly. Frank sits at the computer, clicking away at the keyboard. One by one, the systems return online. Main power, heating and cooling, air filtration, water purification system, communications. But then the system stops.
Something's not right with the comms. I can only receive alerts. No audio communication is getting through. Wait.
The screen prompts alerts from yesterday.
It looks like yesterday. 2 stations were pinging a distress call.
Luke walks up and peers over the shoulder towards the screen. Yeah, one of those was my station. Frank stops, turns halfway towards Luke, his head hung low as he stares at the floor.
Luke, I'm sorry.
Before Luke could respond, another alert pinged on the screen. Another distress call.
That beacon is live. Thule Station is pinging for assistance right now.
Another ping, followed by 2 more.
That's almost all the stations within 100 miles radius.
The two stare at the screen in bewilderment as the distress calls pile in.
Luke, look.
Luke looks to the screen and to his horror sees Station Ambrosia pinging right then and there. He was 5 miles away, stuck on the other side of this storm, feeling worthless to his family. Luke feels conflicted. He feels he needs to rush back through the storm right then and there to assist his station. But he also knows he was here to restart the water systems, or the rest will die no matter what. What do we have left to get the water systems back up and running? Frank checks the water filtration systems.
There is just an abnormality in the temperature. It's too cold for the systems to reboot.
The back exit. It was blown to shit. We need to plug the hole and hope the temperature will rise to normal. Luke and Frank begin to gather anything they can to try to plug the hole. They begin to throw all furniture from the foyer, clothes from all the rooms. They use pots and pans from the kitchen, anything they could find to try and close off the tunnel of ice. Frank turns to Luke.
All right, that's as good as it's going to get. Now we just hope the station can return to normality.
They return to the control room and wait for the temperature to rise. Luke looks at the monitor. Looks like the temperature is rising. We should be good in about 10 minutes. With the passage of 5 minutes, a booming crash was heard from the hallway to the exit. Luke and Frank are startled and jump to their feet. Luke maneuvers his way to the hall, slides one eye around the corner. And for the first time, he sees one. It stood right at the exit. The debris they used to clog the hall scattered about. Luke was breathless. The creature stood 8 feet tall. Its flesh was a white gray. Its legs were at least 5 feet long. They were cocked backwards at what would be considered its knees. Its arms, long and slender, they were almost able to touch the ground. It had hands with 4 long, slender fingers. It was on its hind legs, stretching its head into the air. Its eyes were black as obsidian. No nose. A flat face with just eyes and a mouth. You could see its teeth without its mouth being open, like the teeth were a part of its lips. It shrieks, sending Luke back around the corner. He keeps facing down the hallway and walks backwards, keeping his steps and breaths quiet. Luke arrives to Frank. His eyes widen with fear and his breaths are irregular and short. Frank has seen this look before. We need to move, Frank. Now. Without hesitation, Frank stands and they leave the control room. The creature makes its way down the hall. It takes up the whole passageway. Luke and Frank are on the opposite side, in the infirmary, staring at the massive creature. It gets on all fours and observes the main foyer. It moves towards the water facility opposite of the men. Now's our chance. Luke and Frank sprint towards the main shaft to the surface. Right as they reach the bottom, the power shut down again. Flashing in the dark, the orange-red light makes its return. With no time to waste, the men continue up the stairs. About 100 feet up the shaft, Luke looks back in the darkness. A flash of red and orange revealed the creature at the bottom, staring directly up at them. Then darkness. Another flash, and the creature is on the move. It's climbing up the tracks on all fours. It almost seemed to be jumping with every flash of orange and red. The two men push their bodies to the limit as they sprint towards the bay doors. The creature can be heard scratching its way up the shaft, every noise closer than the last. Frank grabs an exosuit as he makes his way over to the manual door crank. He reaches the hatch and begins to open the door. Just enough space for them to squeeze through.
Go!
Luke pushes through to the outside and gets the manual crank ready for Frank. Frank squeezes through and lets out a shriek of pain. The creature's arm can be seen flailing through the door. Frank made it out with a gash on the side of his arm, falls to the ground in pain. Luke cranks the door closed and the creature lets out a howl as it pulls its arm back into the station. The door slams closed. Luke rushes over to Frank on the ground, who is panting for air. Hurry, we need to put you in this suit. Luke grabs the suit off the ground and helps Frank into it. The oxygen tank spurts air and Frank gasps for his life.
I'm sorry, Luke. I'm sorry we couldn't get the station back up.
Luke holds Frank as they sit on the ground. The two breathe heavily. One problem at a time, Frank. The storm has seemed to calm. No wind, just the bitter cold. It was still and quiet. The light flashed above their heads, orange and red. Another light flashes, but this time not the familiar orange and red, but a bright white. It practically lit up the ground for a moment. Luke stands and looks towards his station. A white light flickers in the distance. To his right, another light of the same color. A light flashes brighter than ever, right above them. Suddenly a craft floats noiseless in the still of the night. It hovers maybe 20 feet off the ground, 30 feet in front of them. Below the light, two silhouettes appear. They step forward into the illumination of the craft. It's the creatures. 4 more creatures appear from underneath the craft. They approach slowly. The snow crunches in the stillness of the night. Frank and Luke can only stare. Exposed out here, there's nowhere to go. A shrill from a creature above startles the men. They are surrounded. Frank begins to cry. Without hesitation, the creature jumps down on top of Frank off the roof. Luke jumps back as Frank screams in pain, and the creature rips through his exosuit. Luke screams, but his body is frozen. Blood spills from Frank's suit each time the monster rips his core. It freezes immediately. Luke's stomach curdles and he begins to run, a last-second attempt to hide. Luke makes it 20 feet before his leg swiped from behind him. He slams into the ground. He screams in terror as the creature towers over him. The creature opens its mouth and screams. Thanks all for listening. Check out the next episode where we discuss and review this story. We hope to see you there, as long as the world doesn't end before then.
We would like to thank Kevin MacLeod for his music found on Incompetech.com.